What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a solo PvE Magicka Sorcerer build that I have been working on. Real quick before I jump right into it, I just want to mention that the reason I'm calling it a solo build is that this focuses mostly on dealing with overland bosses and trying to do VMA and things like that. In Trials, there are probably better ways to go than this. You'd change out some of the skills, focus less on your own resource regeneration, things like that. But the solo aspect of it means you have to focus a little more on keeping yourself alive during those encounters. Because, like I said, you're doing them largely by yourself. Even the world bosses and stuff that they've since revamped to actually require a group of players, supposedly, as opposed to the ones that were pretty easy to kill by yourself before, I believe it was the Homestead update. So, with that said, jumping right into things. So we are playing a Dark Elf for this. Technically, however, the best class for it is actually the High Elf. And that is simply because the Dark Elves actually get 2% less shock damage than the High Elves do. And that's literally about the only difference. They wind up with about the same amount of max Magicka benefits. But technically a Breton would work as well. I just prefer Dark Elves, and a 2% shock damage isn't just enough to keep me from it, just because I prefer Dark Elves to the High Elves. But again, technically, High Elf, the best choice. So Dark Elf Sorcerer, obviously, for our attributes, we're doing a 52-12 split. Again, that's just because that's how I like to do it. The other common splits are 60 and 4, or just dumping everything into Magicka. You'd probably be fine doing either of those things. This is just the way I prefer to play it. So scrolling down a little bit, our boons, because we are using Twiceborn Star, we're using the Apprentice and the Thief. If you happen to be using just any other good set besides Twiceborn Star, you definitely want to go with the Thief for the extra crit strike. So from there, we are jumping straight into the champion points, and then we'll take a look at our armor and then the skill lines from there. So jumping into the champion points, for the warrior, in the steed, we're going to pick up 47 in Ironclad. That's going to give us reducing damage from direct damage attacks by just under 18%. We're going to have 60 in Hardy and 60 in Elemental Defender, which will basically reduce all of the damage we take from everything by about 12.5% each. And lastly, we're going to have 43 in Quick Recovery, just to give us 10% roughly extra healing received, including healing that we give ourselves. So with them front-loading all the points now, there is never a reason to really put more than 75 points into any particular champion point, hence the kind of weird spread there. So over in the Thief constellations, we've got 60 in Warlord, which is going to reduce the cost of Break Free by 20%. We've got 75 in Mooncalf, which will... oh, that's actually wrong. I forgot to change that. That's actually supposed to be an Arcanist, which will give us 14% Magicka recovery. So that's my bad. I forgot to switch that back over. And then lastly, 75 in Tumbling, which is going to give us our dodge 23% reduced cost. So again, don't put more than 75 in these at this point, because the last 25 points are roughly only going to give you like 1%, 1 to 2% on the top of whatever it is. So much beyond that, it's pointless. Now coming over here to the all-important Mage constellation, where you get most of your damage stuff from. We are putting 68 into Elfborn, which is going to increase the damage of our crit strikes by 22.4%. And Elemental Expert, we've got 67, which is going to increase our elemental damage essentially, but more importantly, shock damage by 13.3%. Now over here, we're not putting anything in Spell Erosion, which is spell penetration, which I will explain in a minute, but there is a reason. And then everything else is in Thaumaturge. Now, technically, and we actually need specifically 75 over here, by the way, in Thaumaturge. Technically, only a couple of sorcerer skills actually benefit much from Thaumaturge, like Shock Clinch, for instance, on the Destruction skill. I think Haunting Curse actually gets it. But most of these skills here don't actually take much of an effect from this. The main thing we use that for, actually, though, is to get the extra 10% damage done to off-balance enemies. Because all of our damage is shock-based, which applies concussed, and then several of our abilities set concussed enemies off-balance. And that will give us an immediate 10% damage increase against those enemies. So because we're using almost shock damage exclusively, it's almost like giving yourself an extra 10% damage. Not quite technically, because there's going to be occasional situations where you're not getting this 10% buff, but it's pretty close. So with that said, jumping on to the armor now. So like I said, we are running Twiceborn Star here, which obviously you get the 2 boons instead of the 1 from the Mundus Stones, which is obviously the big thing there. The other one we're running is actually a Mother's Sorrow, just because it gives a crap ton of spell critical. And then our staves are actually just basic lightning staves, high level, mind you, but nonetheless, I didn't have any set stuff for it. Obviously, you'd want to go for like the Masters or the Maelstrom weapon stuff that you can get for destruction staves. Now, technically, and I'm sure some of you might know, Twiceborn Star is kind of inferior to the Netches set for this, and I actually have an item over here to show you what that set is. The Netches Touch set. Technically, this is probably the best you could get for a Magicka Sorcerer. And that's just because it adds so much spell damage to your shock damage abilities, which is every single ability we're using. So essentially, you're just giving yourself almost 400 spell damage. If it's all gold, it is 400, mind you. You're just giving yourself 400 spell damage, basically. So, again, though, because you have to farm all of that gear from Darkshade Caverns, it is all bind down pickup. If you want it all divines and to sharpen staff, you're going to spend quite a lot of time grinding that, whereas opposed to things like Twiceborn Star and the like, what's the other ones? Julianos, Scathing, not Scathing, but yeah, like stuff like Julianos and things, you can just make those if you have worst case scenario, you can just pay for them because they're bind on equip instead of bind on pickup. So if you're going to start with this, I would actually recommend starting with that. But keep in mind, if you spend the time to grind out the Netches Touch set, the damage will make up for it, absolutely. That said, I'm way too lazy to do that myself, but keep in mind that's the best set you can use. So, from there, going straight on to the skill lines. So, for our first skill bar here, we are using a destruction staff in both. I did mess around with a restoration staff in the back bar, but found that it was largely pointless. So, with that said, starting off with the first one, we're using Bound Aegis, which is going to increase our spell and physical resistance by 1,300 each. But more importantly, it's going to increase our max magicka by 8% on top of our racial passives, which are dynamic and resist flame over here. And those two specifically because they give us more max magicka. So on top of that and destructive ancestry, Bound Aegis will increase our max magicka quite a bit. So the second one, and actually this one has a little bit of play. So right now I've got Dark Conversion in there because it's just useful in general, which basically it costs stamina to heal yourself and regain some magicka. However, if you're finding that you don't need to use this often, or if you're not in a situation where it's really required, what I actually recommend using instead is Inner Light. Because again, it'll increase your max magicka by 5%, as well as your spell critical by 2,000. So honestly, either of those interchangeably as you need them. The situation can vary, but typically you're going to use one of those two spells. Now, the third one in this bar is actually the one you can switch around the most. So right now I've got Crystal Fragments slotted up, which if you know what Dark Crystal, I believe it is, I don't remember the unmorphed version of its name at this point. However, normally it's 1 second cast time. You hit them, it does just under 10,000 unbuffed. Mind you, with all our buffs, it winds up critting for like 23, 24 on average, and it stuns them. However, the morphed version, casting any other magic ability on the same bar, mind you, has a chance of causing our next crystal fragments to be instant, deal 10% more damage, and for half the cost, which is awesome. But keep in mind, that's only going to proc if we are casting Shock Clinch or Crushing Shock. Technically, Thunderous Rage doesn't count because it's not a magic ability. So it's only going to proc off these two on this bar. That's what I'm using right now. But like I said, you can actually swap this out for a couple different spells depending on what you want to use. I've actually used Streak here. That works pretty well. You can also use Boundless Storm or Mage's Wrath. Any of those spells are going to be great. Kind of mix it up. Just kind of feel it out. Whatever works for you best. Personally, I like to use Crystal Fragments. As far as what you can change out, those two skills are pretty much it. The rest of it's kind of required for it to work the way I've been doing it. So coming down to the Destruction Staff, which is where the last three skills on this bar are. Number 4 is Shock Clinch, specifically the Elemental Clinch, or Destructive Clinch rather. The Shock version of this is going to do the normal thing, which is initial damage, the dot, And then it's also going to stun the target for 2.5 seconds and deal damage to surrounding enemies. And then we're actually using Crushing Shock because, again, this is solo. If you were doing like a trial or something, you'd actually want to do the other one, which I forget the name of, but it just deals more damage. Whereas Crushing Shock interrupts casting abilities and sets them off balance, which, again, you'll remember if they're off balance, we get an extra 10% buff off that. And then lastly, we're using Elemental Rage. Basically, target location builds at 2 seconds, deals an insane amount of shock damage every second for 9 seconds. And because it is a shock, because we're using a lightning staff, it lasts 2 seconds longer, bringing it up to 9 seconds as opposed to 7 from like the flame and the frost staves. Now this does an insane amount of damage, and it is the ultimate we're using on the front bar because of that. So switching off to the back bar, again we're using Bound Aegis because it stays up when you switch if you have it on both bars. For our second one, we're using Blockade of Storms, and it is your basic AoE. It, you put it down, it does damage. I'm sure most of you know what it does. The third, we are using Lightning Flood, which is one of the strongest AoEs in the game. Essentially, it's the circle version of Elemental Blockade. It does essentially the same thing with the added bonus of doing way more damage and giving your allies a synergy to use if you're in a group situation. From there, we are using Hardened Ward. So this is actually insane for Magicka sorcerers. This is basically a second health bar for 6 seconds. That's how much, because the 12.7 there is unbuffed. When you actually cast this, it's almost always going to be your entire health bar. I've never seen it really be less than that. And that's mostly because the 33% on yourself, which is what the Hardened Ward gives it, it's 12.7 plus an additional 33% onto you. So, it's almost all your health bar, especially as a Magicka user. Your health's only like 17k anyway. So definitely use this if things are looking hairy. And then lastly, we're using Power Surge from Power Surge from Stormcalling, which is going to increase our weapon and spell damage by 20%, and also heal us every time we deal a critical strike every 1 second. And because our crit strike is so high from the Mother Sorrow set plus Inner Light, you're going to heal yourself a lot off this skill. Pretty much most of your healing is going to be done from this, and then you're going to use Hardened Ward in like really rough situations. And then for the ultimate on this one, we're actually using Suppression Field, which is the morph version of, I forget the ultimate ability on this one, but it's essentially the Dark Magic skill line's ultimate ability. And it will stun basic enemies for 12 seconds, silence them, as well as do a 1600 damage every half second for 12 seconds. So it does a lot of damage, stuns enemies that can be stunned, and will silence anything that it cannot. I will tell you, NPCs, it actually silences and stuns them, but that said, that's kind of over the top because if they're stunned, they can't cast anyway, so it's kind of a moot point. However, it does technically do both. This is great for crowd control. If you're against a bunch of enemies that are hitting you rapidly, like 5 or 6 guys, Suppression Field will lock all of them down, especially if they're near each other. So, jumping from here into combat. So, the way this goes is you pretty much throw down your AoEs, keep Power Surge up. You don't need to use Hardened Ward all that often. And then, because I'm using Crystal Fragments, we switch over. We hit Shock Clinch, Crushing Shock, and then as Crystal Fragments procs, we use that. So I have a hard time talking and fighting at the same time, so we're going to switch to some pre-existing footage, and I'm going to kind of walk you guys what I do for overworld bosses and a little bit of EMA here and there. Alright, so first up I want to show you guys what doing an overworld boss with more than one target is consisting of. So basically we just lay our dots down, use Shock Clinch and Crushing Shock where necessary. Try to use Crushing Shock more when they cast if you can. However, it's not super relevant. It will do more damage than Shock Clinch by itself. So it's not necessarily necessary, but obviously try to look out for that. So again, lay down your dots. Use Shock Clinch to stun if it's possible. If nothing else, you're going to want to use it just to get the dot going off of it. And then you're going to use Crushing Shock from there, and then when your Crystal Fragments is up, if you're using that, you're going to remember to use it. If you're using Dark Conversion instead of Inner Light, don't forget about it to get some of your Magicka back as you're using it. But the main thing here is keeping up your critical surge and using hardened ward where necessary to avoid the damage. But as you can see, even against world bosses with 2 targets, it's not a huge deal. You're not taking health so much as you do run out of magicka a little bit and stuff rolling around trying to deal with more of their attacks. Not so much an issue with only 1 enemy versus 2. However, if there is more than 1, I actually recommend using Suppression Field more so than Elemental Rage. Again, that's mostly just because a lot of times they'll summon things. In this case, honestly, I should have been using Elemental Rage. However, a lot of times they'll summon things, so look out for things like that. Try to be aware of that as you're doing it. But as you can see, even against 2, it's actually not that bad. You should be able to do plenty of damage to kill them, as well as keep yourself alive. Now, against 1 enemy, if I hadn't made so many mistakes right here, I would have had plenty of magicka to do this, but it's not very hard at all, really. So again, you just lay down Elemental Blockade, Lightning Flood. You're going to follow that up with switching back, hitting Shock Clinch to get the dock going, and then spamming Crushing Shock for the most part. Remember to keep up your Hardened Ward, Power Surge to make sure your healing's coming up, and then go from there. That's pretty much the bulk of it, though. As soon as you see the Crystal Fragments buff, don't forget to do it. See, this particular boss actually summons several little helpers, if you will. So in this particular instance is where Suppression Field does really well. If you can group them up as much as possible, do it. But as you can see, I just locked down all of her minions for a solid 12 seconds. They're all taking a crap ton of damage from Suppression Field. If you lay down an AoE, or one of your AoEs, you're pretty much good to go in dealing with them. Now, as you can see, the damage from her, or the main boss, or whatever you want to call it, is pretty negligible, largely because Power Surge is just healing us for so much because of our rather high crit chance. It actually comes out to about 71% with just our purple gear that we're using. Again, if I had been paying more attention, magicka wouldn't have been an issue here. If I had sprinkled in more heavy attacks rather than focusing on it, it really shouldn't have been as big of a deal as it was. That said, in those cases, if you do find yourself running out of magicka a lot, again, I mean, you can always use Dark Conversion instead of Inner Light. It's not that big a deal. I would tell you in this particular instance, it was my own fault. Other than that, against 1 target, it's really not much to it. Alright, so jumping into VMA against the Maxis the Mini guy or whatever. So again, I actually mess up my rotation quite a bit, and this guy takes longer than it really should have. But as far as the little minions go, you'll just melt those guys out of portals. A lot of times the stage is what will get you more than anything else. Worst case scenario, grab a power-up. But as you can see, the damage is pretty solid. As long as you stick to your rotation, you'll have a much better time of it. Again, this was my fault. I made a bunch of mistakes right here, and this guy wound up taking forever. But truthfully, not really an issue, honestly. Again, as long as you're paying attention and you keep Power Surge up, as well as making sure you use your Crystal Fragments proc if you're using that when it comes up, the damage is on point. You really just have to watch out for what the stage is doing. In this case, we could have used more movement to get away from the swirling weapon things. I've had a little trouble with Set's Balcony. Again, not so much a damage issue, just as it is getting around those spinning blades. So that's pretty much going to wrap it up for this build, guys. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. I appreciate you so much for watching. I really hope you guys enjoyed the build. If you did, please subscribe. But I hope you guys have a great day anyway, especially if you watched the video for this long. Thank y'all.